Thank you very much, everybody, for a session that proposes to be, I think, very interesting. Life after the big job. I think some of us are all in different places. Some of us have left the big job. Some of us are maybe still on a journey towards it. So I'm sure there'll be lots for everybody in this. For anybody who hasn't met me before, I'm Elaine Roberts. My background, unusually perhaps in this gathering, is B2B. And when I look back over my career, I realized that actually I spent most of my time in critical infrastructure across defence, telecoms, transport, and energy and utilities. And before that, I served in the army. So I'm an engineer who became a marketeer, but I do think there's synergies in both those things, predominantly for me being customers and technology. So after my big job, I now work as a strategic change consultant and executive coach. I primarily focus on leadership change and resilience. I'm also a trustee of Stop the Traffic, which is indirectly how I joined this group through Caroline, who introduced me. So thank you, Caroline. I also do some assessing for the Cambridge Institute Sustainability Leadership and host a People Planet Pint, which some of you may go to. But I'd like to introduce our guest today, and that's Mark Evans. So I've got his bio here, so forgive me for doing a little bit of reading. Mark is an executive level marketeer of 25 years who's now pursuing a portfolio career. We might discuss the use of the word portfolio in a few minutes. I'm sure others will have opinions. In his last executive role, which was at Direct Line Group, Mark was managing director for marketing and digital and a long-standing member of the executive committee. And then prior to that, he worked at HSBC, 118, 118, and Mars in a really broad range of marketing and commercial roles. Today, after the big job, Mark combines executive coaching with a number of non-exec advisory and trustee roles. He works with Accenture, the Marketing Society, Saracens Rugby, HMRC, the Institute of Customer Services, the UK Sepsis Trust, Save the Children, and Onside. He also co-hosts a podcast, The Places We'll Go show, and that's had over 150 episodes to date. Some of you may have listened to that and heard them interviewing people like Paul Pullman, Karen Blackett, Martin Sorrell, Victoria Gosling, Steve Redgrave, Sir Clive Woodward, and a whole range of CEOs and CMOs. Mark also founded the Sprintathlon in 2016. And that's a mass participation marathon event that's so far raised over £900,000 for Stand Up to Cancer. As well as all that, Mark is a fellow of the Marketing Society and of the Marketing Academy. He was recognised as the Marketing Society Leader of the Year in 2018 and awarded an honorary fellowship in 2023. So congratulations on that, Mark, and welcome.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
Not at all. I can tell you're a really busy man, so it's great to have you here today. I counted through that bio and I counted 10 different activities or organizations that you were participating with. I was going to ask you to tell me a little bit more about the portfolio and bring it to life. But just before we came on air, you were sharing that you didn't like the word portfolio and you had an alternative for it. So perhaps you can introduce that as well.
Yeah. Well, firstly, delighted to be here. Rather impressive people on the call, many of whom will be further advanced in their portfolio or whatever we're going to call it. So, this, I suppose, mine is just a snapshot in time, just 18 months in, still learning every day. I think a big part of moving out of executive life is finding a way to let go or maybe reframe one's ego. So I do have a bit of a problem with the word portfolio or plural or mosaic, because I think if we can swear here, the potential it's a bit wanky. So I describe my existence as having a fruit salad. And the reason I do that is it's a bit less ego. And it also talks to the fact that for many people, it will be many different things. So personally, I find bananas a bit slimy in a fruit salad. I don't particularly like kiwis. And other people might have issues with, I don't know, kumquats or whatever it is. So it just goes to talk to the fact that it's an eclectic blend of things. But the purpose of the why of all of this was to have more fun and more learning and to help more. If you like, that was my overarching mission. And so many of the things you've talked about are relatively small, but I suppose I like the people, I like what they're trying to do, and I feel I can make a difference. Even if in some cases, for example, Saracens rugby, my passion point, it's maybe sort of 4, 5, 6 meetings a year for a couple of hours. It's a day and a half of a year. But as is the case for everybody on this call, what's in our brains is very useful just by virtue of the fact we've been there and done it to those who haven't been there and done it. So that's the value exchange. So yeah, there we go. That was a long answer, but more in the fruit salad world than in the portfolio world.
Thank you. You just talked about fun, learning and helping. And I wondered if, as you embarked on this journey, did you start off with those 3 things and then look for activities that interested you? Or was it more organic that people started to come towards you and then you thought, what is it that I enjoy about this? What was kind of your thought process in working out who you'd work with and what you'd do?
The first thing I'd say is having fun, more learning and more help is a terrible filter in terms of saying no to things. So I did get slightly overcommitted at one point in time and then had to rein back in. But no, I mean, it was very organic. It actually started in 2016. I founded the Sprintathon, which is probably the thing that my kids and maybe myself are most proud of, trying to beat cancer faster through running marathons as a group, as a collective. But it taught me that I could use my skills in lots of other ways, maybe slightly more fulfilling ways, in truth. And so that was the first seed. Actually, there is probably a point of origination way back in 1995. Maybe we'll get to that. But at that point in time, I thought, well, I can do other things. That was my first idea, that there was this idea of side projects. And so then I did another voluntary role, and then a new CEO joined in 2018. And by this stage, I was pretty clear that I did want to migrate towards portfolio, or whatever you want to call it. And that was an upfront, explicit conversation I had with the incoming CEO, and she was supportive. I'd already done 5 or 6 years. I was prepared to do another 3 or 4. 10 years would be enough. We'd shake hands. I didn't want to do a CEO job. I didn't want to do yet another CMO job. And so she supported and encouraged me to go for other extra side projects. And so the HMRC advisory role and so on. So by the time I'd come to mid 2022, when Direct Line had a profits warning and it was a natural exit point, I'd already started to have some of these roles, spend more time, be thinking about where I can be valuable to others. And so then in early 2023, I basically announced on LinkedIn that was going to be what I was going to do, and then had a few nice offers. And then I've realized so much of this is about networking, this existence. And everything, I did actually interview for the trustee role I have, but everything else has been basically serendipity and connections and network. So it's been very organic. And then I said in 2024, I'm not going to do anything new because of that overcommitment thing. So I've actually stopped doing anything new for now. Again, long answer, but I think a lot of instinct about where I would be interested and useful.
Thank you. I think it's interesting. I've kind of had a slightly different role, picked up some trusteeships while I was still working. As I said, still a trustee for Stop the Traffic, that some people will know. But I had to sit down and try and work it out. And I ended up using Ikigai and then creating my map and dumped everything into that to start to sort of find out what made me tick. And then I came up with just this phrase, lead good change. And so that's kind of my compass or my little sticks that is it good? Is it good in what somebody's doing? Is it probably around change, and is it involving leaders? So interesting how you've come to that. So when you now look at, you've got this portfolio and you're not taking, fruit salad, and you're not putting any more fruit into it. And some have maybe come by accident more than by design. What have you learned are some of the kind of key skills that you bring to bear from the big job that can really add value?
Well, there's probably 2 parts to that. One is the coaching is pretty straightforward. Many people here will be a coach. There's a set of skills that goes with that around empathy, listening skills, creating connection, psychological safety. Everything else is really in the sort of the fresh eyes space, bringing constructive challenge, the outside in. Obviously, for me, it's around customer transformation. So, I mean, it's perhaps the more interesting thing to say was what I'm actually doing, both in terms of the skills and the bits of fruit, is totally different to my initial assumption. So at that point in mid 2022, when I thought, yes, this is the time, and negotiated a nice exit from Direct Line on, very sort of amicable. My assumption was that I would do some coaching and I would get a few non-exec roles, like proper non-listed, proper non-exec roles. And then two things happened. One was I was spectacularly bad in actually landing any. And the other was that through the process, I realized I really wouldn't enjoy it and I probably wouldn't be very good at it. Because I suppose I still feel like I'm a bit too executive. I do still want to be involved in driving things and growing things and being proactive. And when I talked to really successful non-execs, I didn't really have many of the characteristics that made them really good. And then there was one sort of fatal moment when somebody said to me, if you're really, 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 really good at being a non-exec, then you get to go on the audit committee. And that was like, this is so far removed from my sweet spot. So then I had a sort of a moment of crisis, like, well, so I can do a bit of coaching, but I don't want to just be a coach. For many that works, but for me, I didn't want that. I don't really want to do consulting because that feels like there's a lot of accountability and you've got to chase new business and so on and so forth. And so it was only latterly from about sort of March, April onwards that I realized that there's this whole world of advisory, both paid and unpaid, which has now become my sweet spot. So it was a complete accident. I didn't even know that the likes of Accenture and EY and McKinsey had established formal advisory groups that can help them be better for their clients. And so, genuinely, I was thinking, like, well, what am I going to do now? Because I don't want to do too much coaching. I don't want to do a consulting. I definitely don't want to do non-exec stuff. I don't want to do interim or fractional. And so, but fortunately, it's worked out because I would say, in a nutshell, I've got loads of fun and learning and helping people, but pretty much, unanimously managed to avoid actually having any accountability and responsibility. I mean, of course, that's a bit of a sort of, an exaggeration, but the reality is I have much, much, much less stress than I used to have when I was in an executive role, and much more choice and freedom around the things I get involved in. So I haven't really talked necessarily specifically to the skills, but to cap that question, I would say it's, it is genuinely advisory. Say what you see, be honest, constructive challenge, feedback, outside in, a bit of black book and joining dots. But ultimately, whatever is helpful to the person you're trying to help.
It reminds me of I don't know if some of you have come across somebody called Ben Keane. He does a lot of startup work with Virgin now, but he was one of the founders of Escape the City, if anybody's come across that, and also Rebel Book Club, which is how I know him. And I happened to go on this webinar because I went on lots of free webinars to try and kind of find where I was going to go. And it was around purpose. And then we had a little side chat afterwards in LinkedIn. And his advice to me was, don't kind of try and construct something, follow what you're interested in and notice what you're following. And then somebody introduced me to a beautiful concept, which is from New Zealand, in the Maoris, which is about letting the islands come to you. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. So the gist of it is, it's worth Googling if anybody's interested. But the idea is that the Maoris might be paddling their canoe. They don't have a map, but they're looking at what the tides are doing and where the cloud is. And then they're generally finding their way by looking at those elements. So rather than it feeling like their work moving forward, it feels like the islands come to them. And I think that's a lovely concept. And when you're talking, I sort of feel a little bit like the islands have come to you with that.
Well, that's a lovely thought. I wasn't familiar with it, but it's very resonant. And it actually links to, I already talked a little bit about ego, but this idea, of letting go. I mean, that is a lot of what it is. If you want to move on to something new, you've got to let go of something from before. And I had an epiphany moment in December to sort of name this thing. I do the Wim Hof ice baths and breathing stuff, and I went on the winter expedition, which I massively recommend. It's bonkers, but brilliant. So you're doing all these breathing exercises, and on the exhale, you're hearing time and time again, letting go. And then in the water, it's pretty cold, but it's not pain. Pain is like breaking your leg or something. And so again, it's like reframing pain as discomfort and letting go of the thought of pain. And so I came out of that week thinking, like, yeah, I need to let go. And I can help in my coaching, I can help people to let go of stuff that they're carrying that's unhelpful. And in general, if I let go of what's my own ego to some extent, then I'll be more useful. But I think that is a challenging one, because the reality is everyone's got an ego. Everyone needs their ego stroked. It's what makes us human. But I do think it's a choice about what you have stroke your ego, because for me, for definite, it was the trappings of the corporate career, the team, the budget, the status, the title, being in the key meetings, driving and influencing things, having accountability and responsibility. And I think I would have struggled much more if I'd not had other advisory roles because that's quite a wrench to basically let go of where your ego is being powered. There you go.
I know lots of people talk about how long it takes. I remember reading about an editor of Red magazine, and she said when she stopped doing that, it took at least 6 months. I think it took longer than that for me. Do you have a sense of how long are you still
Well,
letting it go?
I mean, somewhere between 6 months and 29 years and counting, because I mentioned it already, so I may as well go there. The real point of origination about how I wanted to live my life, and I'm now able to do much more so, what was the night of my graduation. So I was fortunate enough to go to university, and I graduated in 1995, Nottingham University. So there's 5 of us going out for a meal on our graduation night. And normally it would be the ceremony is the thing you remember from your graduation day. But for one very specific reason, it was that dinner. And don't get me wrong, it was a very low rent curry house in Nottingham city centre, nothing grandstanding at all. But at one moment, my best mate, Pete, his dad, Pete, said, "Do you mind if I say a few words?" And we all thought it was a bit weird, because this definitely wasn't like a champagne and grand speeches sort of joint. Anyway, shouldn't have worried. Turned out he was a really, really good speaker. And this is what he said to us. He said, "As I look before you, I'm jealous. And the reason I'm jealous is because from this position, you can achieve almost anything in the world. But at the same time, I pity you. And the reason I pity you is because for the next 20 years, you'll go in search of success. And then after 20 years, when sadly maybe the best years of your career are behind you, you'll realize it's not about success. It's about significance. But the really smart people figure out how to achieve success and significance simultaneously." And so it's like, we're young 20 somethings and we'd had a couple of beers, but it really hit. And in truth, I probably didn't listen to that enough in the first 10 years of my career. But when we get together, it's still quite a tight group. Every year when we get together, everybody remembers every single word of that moment. And I think obviously Pete was talking about purpose probably a couple of decades before it became really mainstream. But over time, I've come to realize that at the intersection of success and significance, which will be defined differently by everybody, of course, but at that intersection point in the Venn diagram lies abundant creativity and resourcefulness and energy and impact. And so that point in 2016, with the first Sprintathon, which has now gone on to raise all the money, was the first time I really felt like I'd nailed it. Breaking world marathon records as a group to beat cancer faster. To break the world marathon record without significance would be ego. So the combination super powerful. And then there's just as an adjunct, the final part of that story is that of course Pete is at this event with Matt, who's still my best mate, because Matt's team, his family, are running a lap of the circuit as part of this marathon. And my wife Lorna, who was also one of the 5 at that dinner, wanders over to Pete and he says to him, "You must be really proud." And he says, "Why?" She said, "Well, all of this, come on." And he said, "You've lost me. I don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "Don't you remember Satton's Curry House, 1995, success and significance? This is Mark's first big thing." And then he starts crying because he remembers the speech, and he remembers that was a speech made from regret, because that's exactly what he'd done, pursue success over significance. And he had no idea of the impact he had on all of us. So it's a sort of a rather a long one, but I think now I'm much, much, much better placed to achieve success and significance simultaneously and help the people I coach and the companies that I advise to do that. So I implore everybody who's not figured out what's their version of success and what's their version of significance and how do the two intersect to do that work, because as I said, that's a sweet spot.
Maybe that's the the articulation of your purpose, significance. I think that sounds lovely. I was going to ask you about mentorship or role models. I mean, it sounds like Pete's Pete is, I'm just forgetting Pete is the dad, that Pete has been a role model for you. And then you mentioned before a CEO who you chatted to, but who else kind of in your, you might not have thought of it as your network, maybe as you're progressing through your career, but who's kind of helped you and guided you and given you good advice along the way?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was helped a lot by somebody, gosh, about 8 years ago, who said to me that you're guessing on things. You're really guessing on too many important things, and you should never guess. You should get really good advice. And to which I said, well, yeah, I'm not a brilliant networker, and I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to find the people to get advice. And so they schooled me in something which I've subsequently passed on to many people, about creating like a virtual board of advisors, and how to effortlessly and elegantly network, using something called the Ben Franklin effect, which I might indulge myself in a moment. But so I would say I've had tens, if not hundreds, of pieces of great advice. And so obviously I did speak to a lot of people before going portfolio who had done it, and to get their point of view. Even then, to be fair, I was still a bit misguided that I want to do the non-exec thing. But so there's literally too many to mention. Just a quick thing on the Ben Franklin effect. Has anybody heard of that? It's a piece of genius. So it's one of the behavioral science nudges. So people would have heard of, many people would be familiar with loss aversion, or confidence bias, or confirmation bias, or the Google effect, that we can't retain as well things that we know are searchable. Well, the Ben Franklin effect, I think, is a pretty wicked one that people should be aware of, which says that people are more likely to do you a favor if they've already done you a favor before than if you do them a favor. Quite interesting, isn't it? People would more likely to do you a favor if they've done you a favor before than if you do them a favor. It's not saying reciprocation is a bad thing, because that would clearly be bonkers. It's just a different thing from a neuroscience point of view, because it's about the pathways in the brain. And so the ... of this is, people like to give advice freely because it's self-validating. Asking for advice then it essentially engenders people to be supporters and cheerleaders. And so the best thing I can do is give an example. So let's just say, Elaine, you were my boss's boss, and I know you're recruiting, and I'd quite like to work for you. I could go to you and say, hey, Elaine, can I have half an hour in your diary and tell you how bloody brilliant I am? Or I could say to you, identify something authentically that you're really good at. So, Elaine, I love the way that you present. Genuinely, the way you create connections. The marketing conference 2 weeks ago, I've got a big presentation coming up. I'm really sweating about it. I'd love to know how you prepare and get ready. I know you're really busy, so like, even if you've got 10 minutes, buy your coffee or a Zoom, whenever's good for you. Would you help me like that? And generally, you would say yes, because you've been a bit flattered. It's linked to a need, and it's a small ask. And so basically that's how I've got my advice, is to identify something good in somebody else, link it to my need, and make a really small ask. And I found that a tremendously effective way of getting good advice, no more, no less.
Did you create a board of advisors? Do you think, when you think back on that,
I did, literally. I've got the crummiest PowerPoint slide in the world.
Perhaps just to help other people think about who they might want to bring into their network, could you just give a sense of the types of people, or the roles they had, or the sectors they worked in?
Yeah, definitely. So literally, I created the crummiest PowerPoint slide in the world, which was like an oval table, like a board table, and then with the chairs around. And over time, I've obsoleted that, because it's just much more intuitive in terms of seeking opportunities to network and so on. But yeah, it started with like, well, who are the people I have a really good conversation with? And then thinking about, well, what do they always tend to talk about? Because we all bend the conversation around to our sweet spot. And this, for me, desensitizes the whole thing about having a mentor, because having a mentor with a big M, a capital M, it's quite loaded, it's quite risky, it's quite fragile. And you only tap into their one superpower, and they will always bend the conversation around to that superpower. Whereas having many, many mini mentors with a small M, with their individual superpowers. So then I started to fill it out, and then there would be some people, I have a great conversation with them, but I can't quite put my finger on what's their superpower. So the next time I had a conversation, I was looking for that a little bit. And then I started to think, well, there's some things I need advice on, but I don't really have anybody who's my mini mentor. So how do I go finding people like that? And what I realized is that little methodology of flattering somebody on something they're really good at, applying it to your need, and then making a really small ask, doesn't need to be somebody that you've met. or that you know, because generally it works itself out. The 99% of people who are very willing to give 10 minutes to give good advice are the people you want to talk to. The 1% who are too, like whatever it is to do that, you didn't want to talk to them anyway. So,
What
but
superpowers? It sounds a bit like you're building the Avengers, but
it's the
round the
Avengers Squad.
table,
It's the Avengers Squad.
what superpowers did you kind of look for?
Well, initially I built it around 4 things. So marketing, business, life, and health. And so there were like 4 quadrants. But now it's just much more intuitive. If I give an example, so I help Accenture out in the insurance space. A question came up the other day. What do you know about reinsurance? And I had to say, frankly, not very much, probably not as much as I should for having sat on the Exco for all those years. But that was sort of like in a black box over there somewhere. And so then I just had a little thought, well, like, who do I know and who are they connected to? And so I approached a couple of people and, very straightforwardly said that, I was looking for their advice. And they gave me half an hour and I could suddenly be not an expert, but suddenly be very knowledgeable. So I think it's a confidence to hustle a bit and pitch people, but on the basis that never having to guess is a good thing. I've gone a bit off topic there, but because reinsurance is not necessarily a skill, but it could apply to anything, any skill, any experience, any role. So if you're going to work in a new company, you don't have to guess about the culture through Glassdoor. There will be people who are willing to tell you exactly what it's like. So I do feel too many people guess about too many important things.
Making me laugh when you said about insurance, because I once worked for a company that did something called remarketing, which I didn't know on earth what it meant when I got there. So I was doing marketing for a remarketing company. But anyway, I digress. I would like to go back just to one thing you said, which is not specific maybe to your own experience, but it'd be great to get your perspective on it. One of the things I'd noticed in looking for a NED role, and I went through, women on boards and various other opportunities, and some of you will know New Role and other platforms like that. And when you scan them, it's, I think, with a functional bias, so marketing, it can be very difficult to find a NED role that is looking for customer. It will normally say growth maybe, but very rarely will it say marketing. And often it appears the way you've got to try and find an insight is often through a sector bias. But I just wonder generally for everybody around the table. I mean, I look at it, I think if you're a CFO, yes, of course they want you to chair the audit committee. That is the promotion you can have. But if you're a CFO, it's almost like it's a slam dunk. You can get a NED role, being slightly provocative, but it's much harder for marketeers. What's your experience or perspective on that, maybe from others as much as yourself?
I think it's true. There was, I think, a couple of years ago, a bit of a let's get more growth people onto boards. And I've seen that ebbed away a little bit. So I think you're right, it is challenging. I mean, the interesting thing is why would you want growth people on boards when more or less it's a regulatory compliance control type function holding the exec accountable. And from my point of view, the exec fought really hard to keep the non-execs away from the really big strategic conversations, because that was, why would they know better with actually only a fraction of the information? And so you'd have this grand board strategy day, which was managed to within an inch of its life to make sure that nothing went too off topic. So I think it is a challenge for marketers to get onto boards. There will be some companies who are explicitly wanting very, very customer-oriented boards. But when you've knocked out all the mining companies and all that out of the FTSE 100, 250, there's not that many left. So yeah, I think straightforwardly it is a challenge. But for those who want to go for it, I suppose bringing an edge around how to deliver growth, how to deliver digital transformation is a thing. But it's pretty slim pickings, and very highly competed for. So you've got to be clear on what your edge is. But also, I do know a couple of people like myself who've had the realization that, fate conspired for them to not get a role. And during that process, they realized that probably wasn't for them. And it was perhaps ego or convention or other people's expectation that the obvious thing to do from being a high-powered exec would be to be a high-powered non-exec. So I do wonder actually how many people fall into it. And then when they get there, you think, well, I don't know, is this as good as it gets? I don't know.
One of the other things, I think, if we go back to the 10 things in your fruit salad, and then, you know, there's 52 weeks in the year, there's 168 hours in a week. How do you manage your time across that portfolio to make sure that if I steal something from Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey, he was talking about, he was doing so many things, and he said, I realize I'm going to get a B in everything. So I'm going to reduce the number so I get an A in 3. And I just wonder, across your 10 things, how do you either categorize them or prioritize them or allocate? What's a day look like for you? Maybe a day in the life would be interesting to just understand how you can do your best across everything.
Yeah, it's just on the green lights thing. There is, again, it links to the ego. What's evident to me is that in a plural portfolio, whatever it is, you don't really get to crush it like you would in an exec role, like the completion of an amazing and remarkable project, or, you know, whatever it is, an acquisition, or, you know, as an exec, you have these sort of like crush it moments. And so it's an interesting one about whether to aspire for 3 A's or not. I suppose that's just a choice. So that was just sort of like a bit of a rhetorical statement there. In terms of organization, so the first thing I say is I have to be very organized, because that is the rate limiting step for me to have the most impact. If I got disorganized and start letting people down, then it's the opposite of being helpful. It does structure reasonably well. Basically, I do come into London Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because I still live off the bus of meeting people. Wednesday is the day I'm at Accenture every week. A lot of the Vitality have a monthly exco. There's some of the advisory things, you know, they're once a quarter, and then more or less Monday and Friday is virtual coaching, and then in and around Tuesday, Thursday is face-to-face coaching. So it does, there is actually underneath it all a bit of a pattern. But what I love is that if I look at my diary 6 weeks out, it's absolutely empty apart from the occasional thing. If I look at it about 3 weeks out, it's about half full. If I look at it for the rest of this week, then it's, you know, it's about 90% full. I take Friday mornings off. That's, I suppose, the one sort of give in terms of having a bit of time back. Don't work weekends, don't work evenings. But so I kind of see how things emerge. But even if I look to tomorrow, there'll be spare time that I can be highly reactive to something that's arising for somebody that could be helpful. And so there is that, you know, the scope of possibility 6 weeks out is endless. And then it sort of slowly fills it up on a rolling basis. But I just love the fact that I've still got that flexibility to control, even over a 24-hour period. Yeah. So what's coming to my mind is the Swiss Army knife as a metaphor, that there's all these different things, but it all folds up quite nicely and neatly in the end.
Thanks. I'm a big fan of Oliver Burkeman and the sort of 333. I don't know if you've come across that.
Don't think I have. No, might have done.
His book. You can see there's a theme here.
You're widely read, I have to say.
Just love it. There's 4,000 weeks in our average.
Oh yes,
he lives to be 80, and so he's kind of, you spend 3 hours on the important, you do 3 urgent things and 3 admin things. And I kind of find that, you know, at the end of the day, you can sort of feel like you've achieved something. So it's really interesting. So just, I love learning, as you've only just realized. Obviously, through your interactions, you're constantly learning. Where have you set any time aside in terms of when you continue to learn in a more deliberate manner, or where do you kind of keep getting your new ideas from? I'm guessing you're not always looking to the past to bring something forward, but you're constantly immersing yourself in the future.
Yeah, I think I won't be the first person to say it, that in an advisory or a mentoring or even in a coaching capacity, you sometimes think, is this the Truman Show? Because I'm getting out more than I'm giving. And I think that's true. So when I'm coaching, I'm constantly kept fresh on what's going on inside exec rooms and boardrooms and in the marketing discipline. So that's the thing. Through Accenture, I'm exposed to, and other advisory things, industries and businesses and business models that I genuinely wouldn't have otherwise got to. And then probably the richest thing, to be honest, is the podcast. So Paul is one of 161 guests we've had on. And we go into that, Richie and I, just hugely with a learning mindset. So we used to, in the early days, we used to sweat it quite a lot. I can't remember, Paul, if you were in the early days or not, but we used to really, really prepare. And then I came across a quote from Larry King, who obviously amazing interviewer, who said that the best interviews he did were for people he'd never met and he'd never researched, by virtue of the fact that he had to really, really listen, and the big questions would emerge. And then subsequently, there's a show in Ireland where the host sits down and literally doesn't even know who the guest is going to be as they come out from behind the curtain. And so that's a really, really rich learning experience, an absolute privilege to interview somebody every Friday morning, pretty much, and find out about their life journey, their learnings, their advice, their screw ups. Just it's everywhere. I felt like I was stagnating from about 6 or 7 years into my last job, and from my Mars days, continuous learning was really sort of embedded, tattooed on. And so, yeah, that's the bit. I probably feel like I'm learning more than I've ever learned before. I'm not a great book reader, to be fair. Occasionally listen to podcasts, but through the stimulus of one-to-one conversation or hearing what other people's business challenges are, I feel like I'm still learning loads and loads.
So you've sort of come back organic. If you were looking 5 years ahead, what might this look like?
Well, I said in 2024, don't set any goals, which was a good weight off, as in, like, let go, it will come. The macro goal is to have the best decade of my career. And that, looking at a decade timeframe, which I'd never done before, I was always thinking next job, means that I don't have to care too much because it will just flow and be organic and great things will come. There's a couple of roles I'd really love to do. Like I applied for a non-exec role for the British Lions, and I didn't even get an interview. So again, rugby things. So there's a couple of sport passion points that I might like to get. There's maybe one other organization I'd love to work for, but I honestly I don't. 5 years time, all I know is I will never ever go back to a proper job, because why would I? That's all I know.
I had the kind of let's see what happens. And then when headhunters phoned up, exactly the same as you, I kind of thought, why would you go back? And for much of it, it's a kind of freedom to design your own future, exactly as you've said. Let's just think about the decade and thinking about that quote from, I think it's a Bill Gates quote, but it might be Obama, so probably somebody will put me right. Often we overestimate what we can do in 1 year, but underestimate what we can do in 10. And I think that sense of how change happens absolutely summarizes probably where if we meet again in 10 years' time and look back at what you've achieved, it will be disproportionate to maybe where you are today, although clearly there's a lot going on. So if you were thinking then about somebody else embarking on this journey, what would be your top tips to them for, depending where they are? I mean, some of us are already there and you might be sharing tips with us, and other people might be at much earlier stages and looking at taking on a side hustle. What would be the tips you would give them?
Yeah, happy to. I just love Kim's comment though. Lol, you become unemployable. I think that's absolutely right. Ultimately, all the headhunters have stopped calling now because your value to them diminishes. Anyway, so I digress. So I think I've touched on a lot of these things. So the first thing is about ego, and again, I'm very conscious in this moment because for many people here will be ahead of me in their journey on all of these things. But anyway, the first thing is ego. Recognize you've got one. Recognize it needs to be stroked, but also make a choice about what strokes it, and what's not the antithesis of the corporate trappings, but what is it that's a more worthy thing to fuel one's ego. The second is the why. What's the mission? For me, it was to have more opportunity to create success and significance simultaneously, back to 1995 in that curry house. So, but what's the mission as an overarching? I mean, partly because the only story that matters is the story you tell yourself, and therefore, if you know your mission in your own heart and head and have that conviction about it, then everything else will follow from there. The third thing is definitely networking. So pragmatically, it's all about creating networks and doing favors and the Ben Franklin effect and getting good advice, because it's such a world of possibility. But you've got to be, it's a bit like a funnel. You've got to be in people's consideration, and mentally available, to quote a marketing term. And then the final thing is is start early. And again, everyone here probably already has, but that very first side project, the earlier the better. So when I mentor people in their 20s through the Marketing Academy scholarship, and they're always, they have in their mind that they can start to move to success and significance, maybe in their 30s, like, no, I make that mistake. Start as early as possible, because even that, whatever you do that's giving generously your experience, which is already really valuable, is starting to build a frame of reference about how you can tune into other people's needs and help their needs. I think marketers are primed for this, because marketing is all about understanding other people's needs. But in a nutshell, if it hasn't already started, then start soon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark, for all your insights. You can see in the chat, everybody's really appreciative. I just do love Roy's comment, because I have read that book too, Roy, and I love that sense of giving yourself an A, which is just brilliant. Which, if any of you haven't heard of it, it's Ben Zander noticed that when people came into play for their assessment, they played really badly. So basically, he said to them, "I'll give you an A," and then they just played marvelously when all the pressure's off. So yeah, great to give yourself an A.